Julian, Daniel and Jordy, thanks kindly for your presentations. We might move into the question and answer session now, guys. What are the qualification requirements for a scaffold designer?
You need to refer to your local state jurisdiction to make sure you're meeting their requirements. For instance, like Daniel identified, Queensland Code of Practice is clear about they've gone to the extent of determining what those expectations are. From an OFSC auditor's perspective, obviously, if we're auditing in Queensland, or if you're a national company that features in Queensland, even though the audit might be somewhere else, would be asking you to show us how you pick up that Queensland requirement. That would be something that we would expect. Obviously, systems need to be maintained in accordance with changes to standards, codes, etc. In relation to other guidance, I guess, for companies outside of Queensland or elsewhere, it would depend on the scaffold complexity. For instance, I think the Safe Work Australia guide for scaffolding identifies a scaffolder is able to design a scaffold. There are limitations in what a scaffolder can do, and obviously if they're stepping into an engineering or roles that need engineering interpretation or engineering input, then obviously that's beyond the scaffolder. So I think the old AS 4576, I think it was, or 1576, used to say if scaffolders are able to design basic scaffolds, basically, that don't involve any spreading of loads, where you've got ladder beams, where shade cloths required, those kind of things. So it's not as crystal clear as it should be. But if anybody's, even if you're not in Queensland or you're not a national company, I would urge you to look at the Queensland Code, because that's a really good minimum standard to take forward that identifies different types of scaffolds and when an engineer is required. Obviously, from a qualifications perspective, we would be looking, a chemical engineer ain't going to cut the mustard. An electrical engineer isn't going to cut the mustard. We're talking structural engineers. And there may be a need for advice from geotechnical engineers, for instance, in terms of ground bearing capacity. It's obviously, and again, then I guess you're then moving into the competency and professional competency of engineers. And for the higher risk and more complex scaffolds, the bigger the risk of collapse, etc., then I would be urging people to use professional registered engineers, because that hopefully ensures there's a quality to their output and their advice.
Thanks, Julian. Daniel, if I can throw to you on this as well, what competencies do you look for in the engineers you get to sign off on your scaffolding?
We do a bit of research to base our decisions on. There's no real qualification. All engineers will be RPEQ certified, but it really comes down to their experience, and start looking at their website to see what they do. If they do it regularly, that's a good start. Have a look at some of the photos they've put up of scaffold they've done. Check if they're compliant. If they're not, it's a pretty good indication that may not be the right engineer. But you really need one that does specialise in temporary structures, not your normal structural engineer that designs buildings and does that type of stuff. If you get one that specialises in temporary structures, i.e. tilt up, formwork, scaffold, then that's probably your best, and just to do some research yourself.
Jordy, if I can throw across to you for the next one, there was a mention of some changes potentially coming in Victoria in relation to competency arrangements. Would you mind just talking a little bit about those?
We've been trying for a long time to model similar to the UK around where the competencies aren't just a 3 to 5 day high risk work licence. They're an actual prolonged process to gain your experience, because I think, Daniel, you mentioned earlier around the competencies. You're spot on. It is quite weak. We've had a massive growth around high-risk work throughout Australia, all the way from Western Australia over here to the East Coast. And we're learning differently to what we used to learn. The way, 20, 30 years ago and beyond, there was a lot of old school discipline within how scaffold was managed, erected and managed safely. So, yeah, there is something on the burner in Victoria where we're looking at potentially 2-year qualification for high-risk work. I'll be happy to share once more comes to light with that.
Yeah, thanks, Jordy. Daniel and Jordy, this is probably one for you guys in particular, but how do you pick a good scaffolder, and what sort of competencies do you look for in the people that you engage?
I think for me, and this is only my opinion, if somebody can demonstrate, where ties should be for a scaffold design, like 3 times the least base width, we should be seeing a tie around about this area. If we can understand, how we could hand over a scaffold and demonstrate that it's compliant to the design. I don't think it's fair to say that a scaffolder must know the Australian standards for scaffolding back to front, but I think they should be able to read plans or at least talk to why the scaffold's compliant to a standard or to the manufacturer's specifications without a plan. If they can talk through that and demonstrate that with either a sketch or with the handover certificate, I think that will be a better space than where we're in now.
The foreman and the safety people being on the ground on site are the ones that during the induction process and then talking to the scaffolders as they're about to start to gauge, ask some smart questions around the design and where they're going to start, basing out foundations, and that will give you a good idea from the grassroots when they arrive.
Can we go to scaffolding plans? Obviously, a lot of the requirements that we've been talking about today are based on scaffolding plans and building things to the plan, but when do you actually need a plan? What's the trigger for it?
Similar to my previous reply, the Queensland Code is has done a good job at taking a risk-based approach to different types of scaffolds for the purposes of engineering and design. So yeah, I think that would be the starting point I would recommend people to go to for people outside of those, outside of Queensland or not national. From a criteria perspective, from the OFSC criteria perspective, it's that needs to be a risk-based decision. So you need to have a way of documenting that the scaffold is low risk and therefore doesn't require a scaffold plan. Obviously, that is companies can set their own standard, benchmark, watermark, whatever that is. Provided, obviously, you may come into, if you set a standard that says only scaffolds that are birdcage scaffolds or cantilevered scaffolds require a design drawing, but you've got lots of other scaffolds that should have design drawings, then we're going to have a problem with that when an audit takes place, because the process has got to be legitimate and provide an outcome that's the right one, rather than being used to just to minimise costs or whatever. Again, probably going back to the conversation in terms of when is an engineer required, or what's the minimum for a designer, it would be any kind of decision making that requires an engineer's advice or input, shade cloth, ties, ground bearing capacity, those kind of structurally critical requirements. That would be where we would expect there to be a scaffold plan, and you would be hard pushed to argue that they were low risk and therefore didn't need one from the criteria perspective. Even what could be classed as low risk scaffolds in terms of their use, such as scaffold roof access scaffolds and things, can become high risk. For instance, in the event of an emergency and you've got 100 people using that scaffold all at the same time, then obviously the loading on that needs to be so it's not just purely looking at it, it's about considering the use of it as well.
So for us, it'd be very rare there wouldn't be a plan, and I covered it during my presentation that we don't have the level of competency left in the industry, and the builders are expected to have a compliant scaffold. So the only way for a builder to really have a compliant scaffold is do what they do best and be able to read drawings. And if you've got a good design, then it goes a long way to the builder being able to ensure the scaffold is a fair way to being compliant. As long as the drawing's compliant, then the builder can inspect it to that. And there's so many different factors. If you don't have a design, whether your floors are going to line up, that first lift may need to be at 1 metre to get the next floor. And if they just start basing out and go 2 metre lift, then you're in a world of hurt. Even your catch platforms, if we're talking about catch platforms for roofers, fascia and gutter guys to work at a comfortable height, if you don't have a plan, then the chance of you getting 6 or 7 metres up and it going to be right for the trades to work off is very minimal. So for us, it's be very rare we don't have a plan, which goes a long way to ensuring it's right. And a number of trades have to work off this scaffold, so it's not just one trade. So it's very important that it facilitates each trade's work. Even ties, the builder should be able to pick up whether the ties are going to work in the plans. There may be windows, they might have to change to raker ties, particularly. And Julian spoke about it before. Once you start to incorporate shade cloth, then you've got wind loadings on it. So your ties will be upped from what the normal tie design is at the 4 metre pattern there to facilitate the wind loads.
I agree. It would be very rare that you wouldn't need a scaffold plan. And even if you get a mobile scaffold, they come with instructions from the manufacturer that says this is how you build it. Yep. That in essence is your scaffold plan.
Jordy, is there anything in particular that you guys include in your scaffold plans that the other guys haven't touched on?
Yes, there is. So throughout the training, we got challenged as a business around our temporary works, which was very, very healthy. So a lot of the rail and infrastructure alliances have temporary works teams. So we really went into detail around tie locations, embedment of concrete anchor fixings, We ended up putting our loads, so our live and dead load and overall loads on our that are on our scaffold standards and screw jacks. So we're really progressing in some areas with that scaffold design around the minimum requirements. But obviously some disciplines and some areas of work don't have the resources typical to that. So I think if at minimum, if we can show the tie designs, tie configurations, if we can show load limits that are going to be transferring into the support surface, and especially before one stick of containment sheeting is physically put on a scaffold, if we can have that shown on the plan and verify that the containment sheeting is as per the plan and the engineering certificate, I think we're going to be in a much safer space with managing the scaffold as well.
It'd be very rare also where you don't need the scaffolder to do an as constructed set of drawings. It's very rare that from the initial drawings you're given before they start, that the scaffold is erected 100% to those drawings. There might be a trench in the way, there could be a pit where you have to put in a bigger bay, which then throws out your bracing. Or the stairs could have to move. So yeah, very rare that the scaffold drawings don't have to be amended after the scaffold's erected.
If I can go to a related point, and I guess that's around handover certificates and the requirement to effectively check that the scaffold is built as per design. What are your kind of top tips for how do you do that, particularly given that so many builders are not expert scaffolders?
One opportunity we see through the training is walk it with the scaffolder. So you're physically getting out of your office with a handover certificate. You're having the scaffold supplier demonstrate why it's compliant to the design. And like Daniel's mentioned, a lot of people in construction understand how to read plans. So that's our first opportunity it's the go or no go really. Wherever there's a handover certificate process in place, that's the opportunity to say, yes, it's safe to use, or no, we need to do a little bit more work here before we expose people to such risks as falls, dropped objects, scaffold collapses. So if it's a collaboration and it's a partnership between your supplier and the principal contractor, I know we're going to get the good results, and we do. So that's one opportunity we see.
If you can develop some in-house training for your supervisors, because one of the things we do see is that when we are walking with scaffolders, they'll tell us that it's all right, it's okay to be like that, we can do it that way. So give them a bit of in-house training also. Probably one of the big things is if you're pretty confident the drawings are right, then take the drawing with you when you do that handover. Then you can start raising questions if there are questions, because it should match the drawing, or you may need to get someone else involved because it may not match the drawing, or what the scaffold is telling you is right. Then there may be an in-between.
All right, guys, look, we're almost out of time, but one very last one, because it's come up a few times in the chat, and that's tampering. What are your top tips for identifying tampering in the first instance and then putting in place methods to prevent it?
If we're going through this process of the handover and we're walking the scaffold at the point of handover and identifying all the loose equipment is segregated, it's not on the scaffold, that's the first opportunity to identify a loose component and ask yourself, where did it come from? What does it do? And am I safe? So if we've got nice clean scaffolds, if we're performing alterations and we're segregating loose equipment, that's the first opportunity. There's some very obvious ones. You might walk around a scaffold and there's boards removed from the scaffold deck, handrails are removed. There might be a culture on site where you physically see people do this. If we are in that environment, history tells us that we have risk on our scaffold project, that part of the project with our scaffold. So I'd be really promoting every scaffold user to not touch it. Do not touch it. Even if you're licensed, don't touch the scaffold, because you might be licensed, but you might not understand the scaffold design. It might be a scaffold design which you're not actually licensed for, that you're trying to alter. Plus, you're not going to be the responsible person signing that handover, that scaffold safe for use. So regardless if you think you're qualified, do not touch it.
Another control that I've seen on a few sites now and becoming a bit more widespread is the use of locking devices to prevent ties being removed by unauthorised people. There's a few jobs in Sydney that have got those. So that's an enhanced engineering control. Obviously, you're in the control of keys and things like that, which I don't know how robust that is, but obviously it should prevent ordinary trades doing that kind of thing. So because they shouldn't have access to those kind of locking key. It's not a key, but it's kind of a locking device, like a unique tool. So that's another thing that people are able to look at and use. Again, probably required for higher risk scaffolds, the full facade access scaffolds, those kind of things, where there's a higher risk.
For the tampering, I really believe it's the culture that we create on site, whether any builder there from day one, it should be part of the induction process, really hammering home that do not alter the scaffold, we will alter it for you, all you have to do is ask to come in, and the scaffold's kept clean and tidy. As Jordy said, it's quite easy when you're doing a walk to see a component laying on a scaffold or on a floor that wasn't there before. Then that will lead you to raise the question, where did this come from?
Guys, look, that's probably all the time we've got for today. It is now 12 o'clock. My thanks, first and foremost, to Julian, Daniel, and Jordy for their very informative presentations. Thanks, guys, for the time you put into both preparing those presentations and for your time online today. It goes a long way to assisting our industry to be safer, particularly around scaffolding. Thanks very much to the 580 odd people who dialed in for this presentation. I think that's a new record for the OFSC. Really do appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today and to learn a little bit more about what we're seeing as one of the biggest risks in our industry at the moment. Stay tuned for more details on further OFSC webinars. They'll be posted on our website in the very near future. And in the meantime, stay safe on site, guys.